Love, a word beyond all language. The story of Ukam and Celestia, a tale rooted in the hills of Nepal. Scene 1. The village, the heart and the city that changed everything. Part 1. The village of Sindhupalchok. The village of Karidanda sat tucked between two green ridges in the hills of Sindhupalchok, one of Nepal's quieter districts, where the roads are narrow dirt paths and the mornings begin not with alarm clocks but with roosters and the distant thunder of water grinding grain at the mill below. The houses were old stone, their rooftops spread with drying maize, their courtyards swept clean before the sun had even properly risen. There were perhaps 200 families here, and everyone knew everyone, their names, their histories, their joys and their sorrows. Nothing was a secret in Karidanda for very long. It was in this village that Ukam had been born and raised. He was 24 years old, of medium build with a warm wheat-brown complexion, the kind of young man whose face always seemed to be on the verge of a quiet smile. He was not the loudest person in any room, nor the most clever with words, but there was something in his character that people trusted instinctively, a steadiness, a gentleness, a way of listening to you that made you feel you were the only person in the world. His mother always said he had been born with his heart on the outside, that he had never learned the art of hiding what he felt. She said this with equal parts love and worry, because in a village like Karidanda, a heart worn on the outside could be a dangerous thing. Ukam had finished his schooling in the district and had spent the past 2 years helping his father tend the family's small terraced fields, growing potatoes and millet, selling what they could at the weekly market in the town 2 hours' walk downhill. It was a modest life, but it was honest, and Ukam had never resented it. He had dreams, yes, of a better income, of a sturdier house for his aging parents, of perhaps one day owning a small plot of land closer to the river. But he held these dreams gently, the way you hold a baby bird, not gripping so tight that you crush it. Celestia had come to Karidanda 3 years ago, when her family moved from a neighboring district, after her father took a position as a schoolteacher. She was 22, slightly slender, with a luminous face and eyes that caught the light in a way that made people look twice. She moved through the village the way a breeze moves through maize, effortless, warm, noticed by everything. Her laughter was not the loud kind, but the kind that started in her eyes and arrived slowly at her lips, and when it did, it was impossible not to smile back. She had made friends quickly in Karidanda because she was genuinely curious about people, their lives, their stories, their small daily rituals. She helped the older women carry water from the tap at the crossroads. She taught the younger girls a few songs she had learned in her old district. She was, in the full meaning of the word, beloved. Ukam had noticed Celestia from the very first week she arrived. He had seen her at the water tap one morning filling a copper pot, and the way the early light caught her profile had made him stop in the middle of the path with a stone jar of buttermilk in his hands and simply stand there, struck. He had not spoken to her that day. He had not spoken to her for several weeks, in fact, because the words refused to come when he needed them, and arrived in floods when she was nowhere nearby. He composed imaginary conversations with her while he weeded the potato fields. He rehearsed introductions while he walked the ridge path at dusk, and then he would see her in real life and all of it would dissolve. They met properly, as most things in village life are arranged, through work. The village school where Celestia's father taught needed a small storage room repaired before the monsoon, and Ukam, who had some skill with stone laying, was asked to help. Celestia brought tea to the workers on the third afternoon. She handed Ukam his cup, and their fingers did not quite touch but almost, and she smiled and said simply that the tea might be too sweet. She had lost track of the sugar. Ukam took one sip and said it was perfect. She laughed, that slow, arriving laugh, and walked back to the school building, and Ukam stood there with his cup of too sweet tea thinking it was the finest thing he had ever tasted. After that, they began talking the way people do in villages, gradually and without announcement. A word at the water tap. A sentence at the weekly market. A longer exchange when they both found themselves at the same neighbor's house for a festival. Each conversation was a step taken carefully, the way you cross a log bridge over a mountain stream, slowly, testing your weight. But with each crossing the bridge felt more solid, and by the time the autumn harvest was done, they were talking every day. Part 2, the city and the interview. It was during the late winter that the news came. A government development office in Pokhara, the large city to the west, nearly a day's journey by bus, was holding interviews for several junior administrative positions. The positions were open to young people from rural districts, and 2 of the village elders, who knew Ukam was capable and needed the income, urged him to apply. His mother packed a small bag for him, ironed his one formal shirt until it shone, and pressed 100 rupees into his palm that she had been saving in a tin box under her bed. Celestia, it turned out, was also going. Her father had submitted her application some weeks earlier without telling her, thinking it would be good for her. She discovered this on the morning of departure, when her mother handed her a printed letter of confirmation. She stood at the door of their house with the letter in her hand and an expression of surprised resignation, and then she picked up her bag and went. They found themselves on the same bus from the town. Ukam saw her climb aboard and felt that familiar lurch in his chest, and he shifted his bag from the seat beside him without being asked. She sat down. The bus groaned down the mountain road, lurching around bends, filling with the smell of diesel and the sound of a Nepali pop song from the driver's radio. For the first hour they said little, only watching the hills open up into wider valleys as they descended. Then Celestia pointed out the window at a hawk riding a thermal far above the ridge. Look at it. It doesn't have to go anywhere. It's already where it needs to be. Ukam looked at the hawk and then at her. You say things like that sometimes, he said, and then stopped because he had not intended to say it aloud. But Celestia turned to him with an expression not of embarrassment, but of genuine attention. Things like what? Things that sound small but aren't, he said. She was quiet for a moment, and then she smiled, and they talked all the way to Pokhara. The city was enormous to both of them, though they would not admit it to each other. Wide roads, cars in numbers they had never seen, shops stacked 4 stories high, the smell of fumes and fried food and something sweet from a bakery on a corner. The interview office was in a government building with marble floors and fluorescent lights, and they joined a long queue of nervous young people from districts across the region. Ukam's interview was in the morning. He sat before 3 officials at a long table, and answered their questions about his schooling, his experience, his knowledge of basic administration. He answered honestly and clearly and did not pretend to know things he did not know. And when he came out of the room he felt the cautious calm of someone who has done what he could and left the rest to fate. Celestia's interview was in the afternoon. Ukam waited for her in the courtyard of the building, sitting on a low wall beside a scraggly garden, turning his phone over and over in his hands. When she came out, she looked drained but composed. They walked together to a small tea shop nearby and ordered tea and bread, and for a while they did not discuss the interviews but talked about other things. Whether it would rain that evening, whether the birds in Pokhara were different from the birds at home. Do you think they'll give us the jobs? Celestia asked at last. I think we answered as well as we could, Ukam said. And then, after a pause, I hope they give you one. You're more capable than half the people I saw in that queue. Celestia put her cup down and looked at him for a moment. How do you know that? I've watched you for a year and a half, he said, and then flushed, because it had come out more plainly than he intended, but Celestia did not laugh at him. She looked down at the table and a slow smile came to her face and she said nothing, and in the silence between them something shifted. Something that had been quietly present for a long time suddenly had a shape, a weight, a name. They walked the city streets that evening as the sun went down behind the Annapurna range in a vast, golden conflagration of cloud. They ate momos at a roadside stall, sharing a plate, arguing mildly about whether the chutney was too spicy. They found a small park by the lake and sat on a bench, and watched the fading water go silver and then dark. Ukam did not tell her how he felt that night. But he sat close enough to her that their shoulders almost touched, and she did not move away, and that was enough. More than enough. On the bus home the next morning, Celestia fell asleep against the window, and halfway through the journey the bus went around a sharp curve and she slid sideways and her head came to rest on Ukam's shoulder. He did not move. He sat perfectly still for the next hour, hardly breathing, watching the hills of Sindhupalchok rise up to greet them, thinking that he would remember this moment for the rest of his life. Part 3. After the city, the letters and the silence. Both of them received the job postings 3 weeks later. The letters arrived on the same day, as if by design. They were assigned to different departments in the same district office, a coincidence that the village women who had been watching the 2 young people carefully for months took as an unmistakable sign from the universe and discussed at great length over their morning tea. The weeks after their return from Pokhara were the most quietly electric of Ukam's life. He and Celestia had exchanged phone numbers in the city, and now they texted each other in the evenings, carefully at first, formally, about practical things like when the office would open and what documents they needed to bring. But the formality dissolved like morning mist. The texts grew longer, then came earlier in the evening, then continued past midnight. Ukam would lie on his bed in the dark, his phone the only light in the room, smiling at something she had sent, composing his reply with more care than he had ever given to any school examination. They had not yet said anything plainly. There was a game being played that both of them understood but neither acknowledged, a game of proximity, of small kindnesses, of laughter at things that were not particularly funny, of finding excuses to be in the same place. Ukam brought vegetables from his family's field to her mother, claiming excess harvest. Celestia sent her younger brother with a tin of sel roti to Ukam's house, claiming she had made too much. The village noticed all of it because the village always noticed, and the elders smiled to themselves and said nothing, because this was how love had always moved in the hills, slowly, sideways, in the language of tin boxes and extra harvest. He came to love everything about her in those months. He loved the way she tilted her head when she was thinking, the way she hummed while she worked, the way she never let a conversation end on an uncomfortable note but always found something warm to say before she went. He loved that she read books and remembered what was in them. He loved that she was kind to the elderly and patient with children and honest in a way that was never cruel. He loved, most of all, the way she sometimes looked at him, directly, without guile, as if she was simply glad that he existed. No one had ever looked at him quite like that before. He did not tell her any of this. He kept it the way you keep a lamp in a closed room. It illuminated everything inside him, but he had not yet found the door. Part 4: The Breaking. Celestia's family had a different life mapped for her. This was not unusual in Karidanda, nor in the hundreds of villages like it across Nepal's hills. Her maternal uncle, a man of some standing in their home district, had a son of marriageable age, a decent young man who worked at a bank in Kathmandu and owned a small flat there. The proposal had been discussed for over a year between the two families, quietly, in the way of such things, and by the time Celestia had gone to Pokhara and come back changed in some way her mother couldn't quite name, the proposal had already reached a stage where refusal would mean insult, broken relations, the kind of family fracture that takes generations to heal. Celestia came to Ukam one evening at the end of the ridge path, where they sometimes walked at dusk. She had not texted him that day. She had a look on her face he had never seen before. Not sad exactly, but emptied, as if something had been taken out of her and the space had not yet been filled with anything else. "They've decided," she said without preamble. Ukam knew what she meant immediately, the way you know a sudden cold in the air means the season has changed. When? 3 months. Before the new year. He said nothing. The valley below them had gone purple in the fading light. A dog barked somewhere far down the hill, and then stopped. "I tried to say no," she said. "I know," he said, because he did know. He knew her, and he knew that she had tried. And he knew also that sometimes trying is not enough against the weight of a family's honor and an uncle's expectations, and a mother's fear of being alone in her old age. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't be," he said. "Because what else do you say?" They stood at the end of the ridge path as the last color left the sky. Ukam wanted to say 100 things. He wanted to say that he had loved her since the first afternoon she brought tea with too much sugar. He wanted to say that he had never been as awake in his life as he was in the months since Pokhara, that she had changed the way the world looked to him, that the days without her would be a kind of gray. He said none of it. He stood beside her in the dark and they looked down at the lights of the village below. The small warm squares of yellow in the houses where families were eating dinner and telling each other about their days. And eventually she said she had to go, and she went. He walked home alone. He sat on the steps of his house for a long time after, not going in, his hands between his knees, looking at the sky. His mother came to the door once and looked at him and said nothing and went back inside, because she was a woman who understood grief even when it wore no name. 3 months later, Celestia was married. Ukam did not attend the ceremony. He spent that day on the far fields, turning the soil for spring planting, working long after the light had gone. He heard the wedding music drift up from the lower village in the evening, the thrum of madal drums, the high notes of sarangi, voices raised in song. He turned the earth, until his arms ached, and his mind went quiet. After that, Celestia moved to Kathmandu with her husband. Ukam began his job at the district office. He was good at the work, careful and thorough, and people liked him. He ate. He slept. He did what was required of him each day. But something in him had gone still the way a pond goes still after the stone has sunk. Months passed. Then a year. Ukam told himself he was fine, and most of the time he almost believed it. He did not look for another girl, though his mother brought up the subject with increasing frequency. He said he was not ready. She said she was getting old. He said he knew. She made tea, and they sat in silence, and that was how that conversation always ended. Scene 2, A Far City, A Borrowed Life, and the Love They Could Not Bury. Part 1. The City of Biratnagar, How They Came to Be There. Biratnagar is a flat, warm city in the eastern Terai plains of Nepal, a different world entirely from the cool green hills of Sindhupalchok. No ridges here, no terraced fields, no morning mist clinging to the slopes. The Terai is wide and open, loud with the sound of traffic and the calls of birds in the sal forests that edge the city, hot in summer with a heat that has weight and texture, and in the evenings lit brilliantly by a sky that seems twice as large as the sky above the hills. It was here, in this city that belonged to neither of them, that they found each other again. How it happened is the kind of thing that no one plans, and everyone, in hindsight, calls fate. Ukam had been transferred by the district office to a sister department in Biratnagar, a 2-year posting, offered to him because of his competence and his willingness to go where others were not. He had accepted partly because of the work, and partly because the idea of 2 years away from Karidanda, away from the ridge path where he had last stood with her, away from the village where everyone knew his face and some of them knew his sorrow, felt like a relief. Celestia had left her husband. This requires more than a sentence, because it is not the kind of thing that happens simply. After 2 years of marriage to a man who was not unkind but with whom she shared nothing, no laughter, no interest in the same things, no ease in each other's company, only the polite distance of two people who have been placed in a room together and told to make the best of it, she had reached the end of what she could give. She had tried, genuinely and painfully, for nearly 2 years. She had cooked for him, accompanied him to his work events, sat quietly through dinners with his colleagues, smiled at the right moments. But a marriage cannot survive on effort alone without something warmer beneath it, and what lay beneath this one was only the hollow sound of two people being polite strangers. She had told her family in the gentlest terms she could find. The response had been what she expected: pain, argument, a long night of her mother crying and her father being very quiet, which was worse. Her uncle had not spoken to her father since. She did not go back to Karidanda. She could not, yet. Instead, she went to Biratnagar, where a cousin of her mother's had a spare room, where no one knew her story, where she could begin, slowly, carefully, in the way of someone who has survived something difficult, to find out who she was when no one was watching. She did not know Ukam was there. She was not looking for him. She had packed him away in the same place she kept all the things that were too precious and too painful to look at. The box at the back, the one you know is there but don't open. She was simply trying to get up each morning and do the small things. Eat breakfast, wash her face, find work, learn the city. She found work at a small non-governmental organization that ran literacy programs in the villages on the outskirts of Biratnagar. She was good at the work because she was genuinely invested in it, because she cared about the women in those villages in the way that only people who have come from similar places can care. She walked to the office each day. She ate at a small dhaba near the main road. She called her mother every Sunday. She was building a life from the ground up, one brick at a time. Ukam saw her first. He had been in Biratnagar for 4 months and had grown accustomed to the city's rhythms. One Thursday evening, walking home from the district office through the market area, he turned a corner and there she was, standing at a vegetable stall, comparing 2 bunches of spinach with the focused expression she always had when she was making small decisions. He stopped so suddenly that the man behind him nearly walked into him. He stood there, 10 steps away, and looked at her. She had cut her hair a little shorter. She was thinner than he remembered. She was wearing a simple salwar of pale green, and she was arguing mildly with the vegetable seller about the price of tomatoes, and she was more beautiful than his memory had kept her, because memory is always less than the real thing. He could have walked away. A part of him, the part that had learned to function without her, suggested this clearly, but his feet had their own decision, and before the thought had properly formed, he was walking toward her. "Those tomatoes are overpriced," he said. She turned around. For a moment, she simply looked at him. The vegetable seller said something neither of them heard. The market moved around them. Then Celestia set the tomatoes down and pressed both hands briefly to her face, and then lowered them, and her eyes were bright. "Ukam." "Hello," he said. She laughed. That slow, arriving laugh, and the sound of it hit him somewhere in the chest like a warm stone dropped into still water, and the ripples went outward and outward. Part 2. The Borrowed City and the Life Within It. They did not fall back into each other all at once. That would have been too easy. And neither of them was the kind of person who did things without care. What they did was begin again, slowly. The way you replant something that has been uprooted, giving it time to take hold in new soil. They started with tea. The day after the vegetable stall encounter, they met at a small tea shop near the NGO office where Celestia worked. They sat across from each other with their cups and were quiet for a while, and the quietness was comfortable, which told them more than words could have. Then they began to talk about their work, about Biratnagar, about the flatness of the Terai after a lifetime of hills. They talked carefully around the things that mattered most and concentrated on the things that were safe. And then, slowly, they talked about the things that mattered most too. Celestia told him about her marriage, about the long, slow realization that it wasn't working, about the night she finally said aloud what she had known for months. She told it without self-pity, looking at the table as she spoke, and Ukam listened the way he always listened, completely, without interrupting, without rushing to comfort. "Are you all right?" he asked when she was done. "I'm getting there," she said. And then, "I'm better now that I'm here. In this city. I didn't know why I came here. Maybe now I do." She looked at him when she said it. He looked back. Neither of them named what they meant. But it was named, all the same. The weeks that followed were the kind that people look back on for the rest of their lives and call the happiest. Not because nothing was difficult in them, but because everything in them was vivid and real and shared. Biratnagar in the late autumn is a beautiful city if you are in the right company. The evenings are warm and golden. The parks along the main road are full of the sound of children and the smell of roasting corn from the carts at the gates. The sal forests at the edge of the city turn a deep copper, and the light slants through them at 4 in the afternoon in a way that makes everything look burnished and old and important. They explored the city the way two people explore a new place when they are falling in love with it and with each other at the same time, with unhurried attention, with the willingness to stop and look at anything, with the feeling that every small discovery is a gift. They found a Sunday market in the old part of town where craftsmen from the villages sold brass work and hand-woven cloth, and they spent a whole morning there buying nothing, looking at everything. They found a small rooftop restaurant above a tailor's shop where the owner served only one dish each day, and you took it or left it, and the food was always extraordinary. They found a temple at the edge of the forest where no one else seemed to go, half hidden by roots and overgrowth, smelling of incense and old stone, where they sat once for an entire afternoon saying very little, and feeling very much. One evening Ukam cooked for her. He was not a trained cook, but he knew the food of his hills, the dal of black lentils slow-cooked until it was almost a paste, the gundruk soup, the fried potatoes with chili and turmeric that his mother made on cold mornings. He made all of it in the small kitchen of his rented room while Celestia sat on the floor with her back against the wall, a book open in her lap but unread, watching him work and occasionally making observations that were not entirely helpful. "You're using too much chili." "I'm using the right amount of chili." "Your right amount and my right amount are not the same amount." "Then eat less." She threw a small piece of bread at him. He caught it without turning around. She laughed. He served the food and they sat on the floor and ate together, and it was, without question, the best meal either of them had eaten in years. Part 3. The River and the Rain. There is a canal at the edge of Biratnagar that runs from an old irrigation system, tree-lined on both sides, where the water moves slowly and the kingfishers sit on the overhanging branches like small jewels of orange and blue. Ukam had discovered it on one of his early solitary evening walks and had kept it to himself the way you keep a private treasure, and the first time he brought Celestia there she stood at the bank for a long moment before saying anything. "How did you find this?" "I walked until the city got quiet. I want to come here every day." "Then we will." And they did. In the evenings, when the light was long and golden, they walked along the canal path. Sometimes they talked all the way. Sometimes they walked in silence that was entirely comfortable, a silence that had its own texture and warmth. Sometimes Celestia read aloud from whatever she was currently reading, and Ukam listened and asked questions, and she would stop to answer, and then they would have strayed so far from the original page that they would lose track of where they were in the story, and it would not matter at all. One evening the rain came without warning, the way rain comes in the Terai, all at once, without consultation, a wall of water from a sky that had seemed perfectly clear an hour before. They ran for the shelter of the trees, but the trees were useless, and within 30 seconds they were soaked completely, and they stood under the drooping branches of a sal tree, laughing at the absurdity of it while the canal swelled and the frogs began their chorus with great enthusiasm. "I should have brought an umbrella," Celestia said. "The forecast said no rain. The forecast in Nepal says no rain, then it rains. That's the whole forecast system." He laughed. They stood there in the rain, not trying any longer to avoid it, and her hair was plastered to her face and his shirt was dark with water, and none of it mattered in the slightest. She turned to him, and in the grey, shimmering light of the rain-soaked canal path she looked at him and said his name once, quietly. "Ukam." He looked at her. "I never stopped," she said. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. He took her hand. The rain came down. The frogs sang. And that was how it was finally said, not in words but in the oldest language there is. Two people standing in the rain, holding on. Part 4, a city that belonged to them. After that evening there was nothing hidden between them. What they had built in Biratnagar was a life, small, imperfect, utterly theirs. It existed outside the gaze of the village, outside the architecture of family expectation and social judgment. In Biratnagar they were simply Ukam and Celestia, two people from the hills who had found each other in a flat city far from home and who were, against all the evidence of the past few years, profoundly happy. They had their rhythms and their rituals. Every Sunday they cooked together, a project that inevitably involved disagreement about seasoning and reconciliation over the finished dish. Every Tuesday evening Celestia went to a reading group at the small English medium school near her office, and Ukam would meet her afterward and they would walk home under the streetlights. On rainy evenings they stayed in, and Celestia sewed, and Ukam read, and they played music from a small Bluetooth speaker. Old Nepali folk songs, sometimes Hindi film songs from the 1970s that they both knew, but pretended to only half remember, singing along badly and without apology. He learned the specific weight of her silences, the silence of deep thought, the silence of mild irritation, the silence of contentment. She learned the specific quality of his attentiveness, the way he turned fully toward her when she spoke about something that mattered to her, the way his expression changed very slightly, when he was moved by something and was trying not to show it. They learned each other the way you learn a piece of music that you will play for the rest of your life. Slowly, carefully, until it lives in your hands. There were hard days too. Days when the distance from family pressed upon them. Days when Celestia thought about what the village would say, what her mother was saying, what the whispers at the water tap in Karidanda sounded like now. Days when Ukam lay awake and thought about his parents growing older without him nearby, and felt the guilt of it like a stone in his chest. These days they did not try to fix for each other, because some things cannot be fixed. They simply kept each other company through them, which is its own kind of grace. One evening, walking back from the canal as the first stars appeared above the sal trees, Celestia said something that Ukam kept with him for a long time afterward. "I know this city doesn't belong to us. I know we can't stay here forever hiding from who we are." Ukam was quiet for a moment. "I know. I want to go back," she said. And then, very softly, "But I want to go back as what I am. I don't want to go back pretending." He stopped walking. He turned to her. "Then we go back as what we are," he said. She looked at him for a long time in the starlight. "They might not be ready for that." "Then they'll have to get there." Scene 3. He said. Return, and something in the steadiness and the weight of what matters. The old, unshakable Ukam quality the decision to return from the beginning. They planned to take his hand and hold it very tightly. When the rhododendrons on the ridge would be in bloom, the potato fields would be newly planted, and the village would have the particular sweet energy of the season's beginning. Ukam had served nearly 2 years of his Biratnagar posting. The transfer back to Sindhupalchok was approved. The time had come. They did not go in secret. They went the way they had decided to go, openly, together on the same bus from Biratnagar to the Sindhupalchok district, then by shared jeep up the mountain road, and finally on foot along the ridge path that both of them had walked 1,000 times alone and were now walking side by side. The village appeared below them as they reached the final ridge, the familiar sight of stone houses and terraced fields, smoke rising from cooking fires, and the old pipal tree at the crossroads visible from miles away. Ukam stopped. "Ready?" he asked. Celestia looked at the village below. She had not been back in over 2 years. She could see her family's house from here, the blue-painted door frame, the goat tied to the post outside. She breathed in slowly. "I've been ready for a long time," she said. Part 2. The village receives them. The village's reaction was not exactly what either of them had feared, but it was not simple, and it did not happen all at once. That is the truth of real life, which is rarely as clean as either our hopes or our fears. Ukam's mother saw him from the doorway of their house before he had even reached the courtyard. She stood for a moment, her hands pressed together, and then she came forward quickly. She took his face in both hands and pressed her forehead to his. She did not speak. She simply held him for a long time. Over his shoulder she looked at Celestia, standing a few steps behind, and her expression shifted through several things: recognition, memory, something complicated, and then something simpler. She released Ukam, stepped past him, and took Celestia's hand. "You look thin," she said to Celestia. It was the most Ukam's mother thing she could have said, and Celestia felt tears come to her eyes quite suddenly. "I'm all right, Ama," she said. "Come inside. I'll make tea." Celestia's own family took longer. Her father was a quiet man whose silences had always been a form of language. For the first week he said very little, which could have meant many things, and they could not be certain which. Her mother cried more than once, not in anger, but in the kind of grief that is really just the release of a long-held worry, the body's way of saying, "I was afraid, and now you are here, and I can stop being afraid." The uncle who had arranged the first marriage did not come to the house. That fracture would take time. Not everything heals at once, but the village, which gossips and judges and always has an opinion, surprised them both. The older women of Karidanda had a meeting of sorts, the informal kind that happens at the water tap and in the courtyards when the men are in the fields. They talked about Celestia and Ukam with the frankness that older women in Nepali villages often have when no one in authority is listening. They noted that the first marriage had been wrong from the start, that anyone with eyes could see Celestia and Ukam belong together, and that the uncle's choice had been about the uncle's pride, not the girl's happiness. They noted that Ukam was a good man. Everyone knew he was a good man, and that good men were not so easily found that you threw them away for the sake of form. They noted, with the authority of people who have seen many generations of love and loss in the same small valley, that love which survives 2 years of separation and a city far from home is not a passing thing, and should not be treated as one. The oldest woman in the village was a grandmother called Muna Bajai, who was somewhere north of 80. She had outlived 2 husbands and 4 harvests of extraordinary difficulty, and her opinion on any matter was treated as something close to scripture. She sat under the pipal tree one afternoon when Ukam and Celestia passed by. She called them over and looked at them both for a long moment with her small, sharp eyes. "You came back," she said. "We came back," Ukam confirmed. She nodded slowly. She looked at Celestia. "My first husband was chosen for me," she said. "And then, my second husband was chosen by me. That is the one I buried with all the rituals and all the grief and all the love. You understand?" "Yes, Bajai," Celestia said softly. The old woman made a small sound of satisfaction and turned her face back to the valley. They understood that the conversation was over, and that it had been, in its way, a blessing. Part 3. The Gathering on the Road. It was on a Thursday, market day in the lower town, that they encountered the crowd. They had borrowed a motorcycle from Ukam's cousin to go down to the lower village on an errand. The road was the same mountain road they had both traveled all their lives, winding through forests and terraced fields, past small shrines with marigold offerings and houses whose dogs knew you if you passed often enough. Ukam drove and Celestia sat behind him, her hands light on his shoulders. They talked about small things, what to buy at the market, whether his cousin's motorcycle needed oil, whether the rain that had threatened that morning would come by afternoon. On the lower ridge road, they came upon a crowd. Perhaps 60 or 70 people were gathered at a bend in the road, facing inward. The sound from them was the low, overlapping murmur of many voices in distress. Ukam stopped the motorcycle and they got off. "Stay here," he said, and walked toward the crowd. The crowd was dense. He pushed forward. "Please, let me through. What's happened?" No one answered him. No one seemed to hear him. He pushed harder and still could not get through. He felt a sudden cold unease, as if the crowd were a wall he could not breach. He could hear fragments of what people around him were saying. Terrible thing. Loved her so much. The family pressure drove him to it. Everyone saw it coming. He had her photo on his phone, right there on the screen, even at the end. What kind of a world is this that it can't leave two people alone to love each other? The cold feeling in Ukam's chest deepened. He pushed forward again with all his force, and this time his hands went through the person in front of him as if through smoke. He stopped. He looked at his hands. He looked at the crowd around him, people he recognized, people from the village and the lower town, and none of them looked at him. None of them registered his presence. He was there, but he was not there. Then he looked down, past the bodies of the people around him to the ground. And he saw it. A mobile phone, face up on the road. The screen was bright. On it was a photograph, a young woman in a pale green salwar standing at a vegetable stall comparing two bunches of spinach. Her face was caught in profile, an expression of focused attention and something like laughter at the corner of her lips. It was the photograph he had taken of Celestia on the afternoon he had first seen her again in Biratnagar. He had taken it without her knowing because he had wanted to keep that moment, her in the ordinary world, alive and real. His phone. His photograph. Him. The crowd around him shimmered and went pale. The sound receded to a great distance. The road, the ridge, and the valley below all bleached slowly to white. In the white there was silence, and in the silence there was a door. A great black door stood at the end of a white corridor that had no walls. In the door's frame stood a figure, dark, vast, patient, not threatening but absolute, the way a mountain or the end of a day is absolute. The figure did not speak. It looked at him and raised one hand, slowly describing an arc that meant, "Come, this way, now." And then, from somewhere, not from the crowd, not from the road, but from somewhere at once very close and very far, he heard her voice. He heard Celestia. She was crying. Not the quiet crying he had sometimes seen her do, the private kind. This was deeper and more broken, the sound a person makes when something has been taken from them that the world had no right to take. Ukam, Ukam. His name in her voice, over and over, receding or approaching, he could not tell. The white around him pulsed once, twice, and the door and the figure and the silent white corridor trembled like a reflection in struck water. He opened his eyes. He was sitting on the road. The motorcycle was 5 steps behind him. Celestia was kneeling in front of him, both hands on his face, her eyes very wide and very dark. Ukam. Ukam, look at me. Look at me. He looked at her. There you are, she breathed. Her hands were shaking. What happened? You walked into the crowd and then you stopped. You stood there and you wouldn't answer me. Your eyes were open, but you weren't there. I've been calling your name. She stopped. She pressed her forehead to his, the way his mother had, and held it there. The crowd was gone. The road was empty in both directions. The valley below was green and quiet and ordinary. Somewhere above them, a kite called. The afternoon sun was long and warm. What did you see? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. A door, he said. A door. And someone in it. Waiting. She lifted her head and looked at him. Did you go through? He looked at her, her face that he had loved in a village, in a city, in a borrowed life, and all the spaces in between, and he almost smiled. I heard you, he said. She was quiet. Her eyes filled. Good, she said at last. Just that. Good. He got up slowly, and she helped him. They stood on the road together in the afternoon light, her hand in his. The valley lay below them, green and terraced and ancient, with smoke rising from the houses and the sound of children somewhere downhill. When they finally walked back to the motorcycle and Ukam started the engine, Celestia leaned forward and put her arms around him from behind. Not the light touch on the shoulders she usually used, but a full embrace, her face against the back of his neck. Don't you do that again, she said. Do what? Go somewhere I can't follow. He put his hand over hers. I won't, he said. The motorcycle moved down the mountain road. The valley opened below them, wide and welcoming. The village of Karidanda waited with its stone houses and its people who were, slowly and imperfectly, learning to make room for them. The road wound down through the rhododendrons. The light was the color of honey. They went home. The end. Love is not the absence of difficulty. It is the presence of someone who stays.
From From Sindhu Palchok's hills we knew a bond of love forever true. Then Pokhara's call, the city's gleam, pulled us apart from our shared dream. On a motorcycle side by side, with nothing left for us to hide, back to Curry Danda's welcoming sight, riding home in the golden light.